Hello and welcome back to this damn fully dualistic crusade. This video is a review of the beautiful new 40th anniversary release of the score for Octopussy by John Barry, and of course on the beautiful 2 CD set by La La Land Records. This goes hand in hand with their recent release of the expanded anniversary release of Live and Let Die score by George Martin, and proved to be the greatest single announcement in terms of James Bond physical media releases in a great number of decades, actually. And just like the Live and Let Die release, the score for Octopussy has been given really royal treatment and finally rights a wrong in finally giving us something other than the original 1983 album program that we've been stuck with all these years. And it really helps to allow the listener and Bond fan to actually gain a new appreciation for John Barry's score. It is definitely the most, I would say, in certain areas, sedate of his scores, because on the surface it might not seem as attention grabbing as some of his other much more discussed and more famous James Bond scores. But I think the album program, as good as it was, being so limited, has made discussion and appreciation of the Octopussy score something that you really don't see all that often. It's definitely the John Barry score that seems to fly under the radar the most in comparison to his other Bond scores. But it's also fitting in his particular stylistic change, of course, when he started moving to a more string-oriented and focused, for lack of a better term, the more, I guess, romanticized feel that you get from his later career in terms of his scores. In terms of the Bond scores, you start to feel it most notably in The Man with the Golden Gun, and that was the point at which he had started basically having gaps between his Bond scores, especially after his movie to America, and then he was not doing Bond scores consecutively, and other composers came in. And just like those, he returns to the Bond scores here on Octopussy to score his first Bond of the 1980s, and thus his first of the John Glenn era of films. And so Octopussy is a very important score to set the stage for his, unfortunately, final two scores for the series, A View to a Kill and The Living Daylights, because you'll note things that Barry starts in particular in his Octopussy score are themes and certain elements that are echoed and built upon in the final two scores. And like every Barry Bond score, when you listen to the music in its entirety, you'll note some of his own stylistic flourishes, and you can draw parallels or connections, or basically hear echoes of some of the past scores, notably On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and even From Russia with Love here and there, and of course Goldfinger, among others. And that's just natural for any composer working with the same series time and time again. Now, usually the first thing people will point out, and what you see in all discussion of the score, is that there is a great usage of the actual James Bond theme from Dr. No that Monty Norman is credited with, and that is really obviously a means of trying to combat the potential success of Never Say Never Again, which was released in the same year of 1983. And of course, since that film had the return of Sean Connery to the role, it was important for the Eon production to really underline every aspect of the tried and true series iconography. Most notably in the musical realm is, of course, the actual iconic James Bond theme. So that's why you hear a prevalent usage of the Bond theme throughout Barry's score in a lot of different areas and in different workings to underline that this is essentially the Eon James Bond. This is the official James Bond versus Never Say Never Again, which had the Michel Legrand score, which was criticized at the time and has been criticized ever since as not fitting a James Bond film, which frankly it really doesn't. I myself like elements of it. I think it's been bashed around too much, but it certainly doesn't fit the film, and it's no comparison to a master at work as we have in Barry's Octopussy score. But that's why you have the greater prevalence of the James Bond theme. But of course, Barry wasn't one to just needle drop the James Bond theme in willy-nilly. He works it in to the various cues and, of course, plays around with it. He uses it in deconstructed ways, but also always with the knowing that the James Bond theme represents Bond as a character, Bond's actions. It is to be used in Bondian moments for Bondian flair to highlight those particular moments. But in his clever deconstruction of the theme. And there's nobody who was ever better at this particular usage of how do you make the James Bond theme play, and how do you work it into your original score, and how do you make it fit every scene under the sun where it's applicable, and not simply needle drop in the iconic James Bond theme. So that's why you find little versions of it or segments of it consistently throughout the score. And this is something that Barry would continue and build upon in his final two scores. So again, what Octopussy sets as a precedent is reflected upon and built upon in A View to a Kill, which adds a greater sense of tension and danger, which is then enhanced further in The Living Daylights. So again, everything here in the Octopussy score is basically built upon in his final two scores. But also, it is a score that is fully reflective of the film. That was one of Barry's great talents. And Octopussy is very much... Well, I mean, it's very much two different films. And that's one of the most convoluted plots in the series, because it's basically two entirely separate plots. And it is very obvious that the Eon team was reacting to the runaway success of Raiders of the Lost Ark by opting for the India setting and the real feel of trying to get a Boyzone style adventure film into the mold of a Bond film. So at its core, you really have two distinct different types of film going on in Octopussy. You have the exotic, frankly, older period, much more pulp adventure set in exotic locales in all of the India sequences. But then you have the pure Cold War thinking man's thriller contained within it. And that's one of the film's great conceits, that at its core, there's a particular moment when the bomb is revealed where all the levity we've had in the film sprinkled throughout, that this is a lighter film, goes out the window, because we go into full out-and-out Cold War thriller territory. So there are moments of extreme drama filtered throughout. And this goes hand in hand with the screenwriting team of Richard Maybaum and Michael G. Wilson, constructing all of the 1980s films out of either unused pieces of Ian Fleming material, or especially the short stories, as is Octopussy, constructed primarily out of one of the short stories as the sort of impetus and jumping off point. But of course, you also have the primary writer of the film being George MacDonald Fraser, most known for his Flashman novels, and I think that's what really heightens the old-fashioned Boyzone style adventure elements of the film and make it feel so distinct from even the rest of the Bond film canon. It was wise of them to try this out at this point, as it was an area Bond had not moved into, and you had it as a sort of reaction to Raiders of the Lost Ark. And ironically, Octopussy as a film would actually influence Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, most notably in the dinner scene, because Spielberg was himself a great Bond fan, and Indy was very much patterned after the Bond films in a great number of ways. So it's interesting to note that Raiders influenced Octopussy, and Octopussy influenced Temple of Doom, which of course had the Indian locale and was an even more 1930s pulp adventure than Raiders was in a lot of ways. So it's interesting looking at the film coming out of this period, but that means you have to look at Barry's score for how adroitly it manages to bridge the two different styles of film, because he does it at a drop of a hat, and it requires a composer of incredible skill to be able to jump between completely different tones. This is the film where Bond hides in a gorilla suit at one point, and of course infamously dons a clown disguise to break into the circus on the U.S. airbase to try and defuse the nuclear warhead. So it is a film that is walking a tightrope of tone, and some feel it makes some missteps, and others absolutely adore it. But it's all the more remarkable that it's able to, for the most part, accurately navigate this incredible tightrope. And the score does exactly the same thing. The score is what keeps the film in line, essentially, and helps to, for the most part, keep it from going too far to either side, and sort of navigate this pathway. There are also portions of the film that are deliberately left unscored. And I think you also have to take into account that Barry was still, in some ways, reacting to the development of cinema sound in terms of Dolby Stereo and multi-channel technologies being not only much more utilized in films after the success of Star Wars, especially in 1977, but also his experiences on Moon Moonraker, the last film that he composed for in the series, which in 1979 was the first Bond film officially released in Dolby Stereo and may or may not have had a 70mm blow-up as well. But there's actually some record that Barry was not really the most pleased about how his score was handled, and that he felt in some areas his score was not treated very well in regards to the overall balance between the dialogue, music, and effects, that the sound effects in particular were given precedence in areas, which is understandable for a composer to feel that way, and it is a very delicate, fine art of getting a mix balance right. And there were many films in this era that they didn't have the most finessed sound mixes, and you can tell it was a newer sort of technology full of hurdles for not only film productions but various sound mixers to get over, and some had more time and money versus others. You can even see this reflected in the Bond films first sort of testing the waters, with The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker as the first non-mono films to have major releases in terms of anything that wasn't necessarily mono, although there is evidence of some of the early films having alternate sound presentations that are just unfortunately not available to the public. But by the time of For Your Eyes Only, and especially Octopussy, it seems the Bond team had really gotten a handle on multi-channel mixing. And so for the time period especially, they are exceptionally good Dolby Stereo mixes, although you hear them today on modern releases in terms of the film mix, and they are 5.1 remixes of those original mixes that don't have the same punch or clarity because, unfortunately, the studios can't leave things alone. So if you want the best sounding version of Octopussy in terms of the film mix, you still have to go to the MGM UA letterboxed Laserdisc edition, which has a digital PCM version of the original Dolby Stereo track in terms of the original general release Dolby Stereo mix. This is still the best iteration of the film in terms of audio on physical media releases, and thus John Barry's score sounds its best in terms of how it sounds in the final film mix, which has a few little differences compared to the soundtrack version and, of course, even the expanded new La La Land release. Also, Octopussy did get a 70mm blow-up, which also meant it had a Dolby 6-track mix for those particular blow-up prints. This was done to, again, compete against Never Say Never Again, and both films were released around the same time in the summer of 1983, which led to the so-called Battle of the Bonds at the box office. So, obviously, the Eon team and MGM were determined to make this as big of an affair as possible. And unfortunately, that 70mm mix is seemingly nowhere to be found and is not available for the public to hear. So ultimately, Octopussy is a sort of transitional score for John Barry in terms of he had not scored For Your Eyes Only, which had the incredible but very bombastic Bill Conti score. And so he had a single film absence, essentially, comes back for Octopussy, and of course had his different style, which was a bit more sedate, a bit more romanticized, and not necessarily something that would perfectly translate to an action film, especially one with a heavy 1930s pulpy flavor, and a film that was also simultaneously a very dramatic Cold War thriller. So it's a film that straddles so many different areas that it's remarkable how well Barry just seems to have instinctively picked up on this. This is a score with really incredible highlights in terms of the individual cues that generate menace, particularly in the opening stalking of 009, but also can do the iconic bits of action. The entirety of the music for the pre-title sequence is really a small John Barry masterclass in how to score a James Bond film, because it manages to be tense and suspenseful, but also reflect Bond's character, reflect the danger of the mission in the unnamed country we're in, but also hit elements of humor that come through in the action. And in particular, it's not necessarily the bigger moments that stick with you the most. For me, the section of the pre-titles music that always sticks in my head is actually when Bond is escaping the paratroopers and in the back of the military jeep with the aid of the lovely Bianca. It's a perfect example of how John Barry's James Bond scores basically in a lot of ways, they take the place of the internal monologue from the Ian Fleming novels and have a similar degree of wit and humor and can perfectly fit the through line of the individual scenes. And his more romanticized style does really help and go along with the romance scenes between Bond and Octopussy and the development of their relationship. But then Barry is able to go right into the action cues. You just have to look at the yo-yo fight sequence in Octopussy's bedroom. That's a perfect example of Barry's ability to immediately go from very somber, lush, romantic sounds to a really nicely worked out action motif that is then used for the major action sequences in the film. And there's a nice distinction of the musical styles. There's a certain set feeling for all of the India sequences. There's in fact an actual India theme of sorts, and it's amazing to finally have that on disc on the new release. But also the music for essentially all the Cold War thriller sections, all of the scenes in East Germany dealing with the mad plot of General Orlov have a unique, very focused, very dramatic flair of their own that very much help to distinguish all of those scenes from the sort of old-fashioned throwback adventure scenes of the India sequences. So Barry's score very much distinguishes the two different plots, but also provides enough linkage between the two that helps to smooth over any feeling of the storylines being too disjointed from one another. And again, this is topped off by the repeated usage of the James Bond theme throughout, again, to highlight this as the official Eon film, to set it apart as the real and true James Bond film in comparison to Never Say Never Again and the Michel Legrand score. So it is, again, a score that is easy to remember iconic moments from, but also one that's easy to sort of gloss over because in comparison to the other John Barry scores, it may not be always as flashy, and the two different styles to represent the two different storylines, essentially, they have individual moments that stand out so greatly that it's easy to overlook the rest of the score or the smaller moments. And in fact, it's a lot of the smaller moments and moments for quieter scenes or moments of character introspection that are some of the strongest. Just as it's important to look at the parts of the film that Barry chose not to score. Those are just as important. One of the hallmarks of a truly great composer is knowing when not to score a sequence. And so here in Octopussy, you have several iconic moments that don't really have score. Basically, you have some source music and drums in the background during the manhunt sequence, and also a great deal, well, practically all of the train sequence with Bond running on top of and hanging on the side of Octopussy's train is left without score. And that in particular, well, really both moments, I think, indicate that Barry was still thinking about how his music would be basically having to fight against the sound effects. And those two set pieces in particular are moments that are very reliant on sound effects. In the jungle, you have the sounds of the jungle, the sounds of the elephants, the hunters, the drums, the guns being fired. And so there's only specific moments where you have a musical sting, such as when Bond walks through the tarantula nest. But unfortunately, that particular piece is not on the new La La Land release. It's pretty much the one major thing I can think of that is not on there. But that probably is due to it maybe being a last minute or later change, and it wasn't on the source tapes that they were accessing. But that's the only thing I can think of that isn't really on this new release. That and the little bit of background music during the backgammon sequence between Bond and Kamal Khan, which again is sort of source music, and I guess it was just not available on the tape source they found. But it's also, you have to look at the train sequence for having the basically being focused on the sounds of the train and the engine and the roar of the train as we're going by, and the whooshing effects as things going by, and the Bond flailing around on the train, and the thumps and impacts and things. So it makes sense why Barry chose not to score that sequence, and the sound effects really are the music for that sequence. And again, it's the mark of a great composer that you know when not to score. But interestingly, on this new La La Land release, there are some bits of unreleased music and some different cues that we have just not heard before, and it leads to greater study and appreciation of how the final film score was done. So this is a release that not only has a beautiful restoration of Barry's score, resulting in quality we've never heard before, but also it allows you to go back to the actual film and study how the score was spotted, and also how there were some other tweaks and also some cues that were not used. And it basically allows us as fans to go back and study further the development and the actual process of fine-tuning the score to what we got and what we're used to in the actual film mix itself. For me, there are certain moments of the Octopussy score that are real standouts and basically encapsulate everything I love about this score all into specific moments. I think certainly the pre-title sequence, but also the opening in East Germany with the tracking and killing of 009. Also the cue known as That's My Little Octopussy, the scene between Bond and Magda in Bond's hotel room, is an incredibly beautiful and very somber moment, especially when Magda slips out in the middle of the night. It's just a beautifully rendered cue that perfectly highlights the internal never-ending loneliness that is part of the Bond character, but also all the other romance scenes, of course, but then you also have the incredibly dramatic and suspenseful piece for the chasing of the bomb on the train as soon as it's revealed. It's an incredibly dramatic cue that carries along that entire sequence. And then in particular, I think the absolute highlight, the moment we all sort of associate with the film, and really the most old-fashioned adventure moment of them all is, of course, the banister slide that Bond does in the middle of the final assault on the Monsoon Palace. And when we get that, we get Roger Moore sliding down the banister, firing an AK-47, and that's the most classically triumphant version of the Bond theme. But what I love even more than that, my favorite section of the entire score, is actually just after that. Part of the same piece of music, so it's still part of the same track on the soundtrack releases, but it's just after that when Barry continues to use the Bond theme, but tweaks it a little bit further to have a different sort of tension and tempo, because it's the moment where Bond is trying to chase Kamal Khan and Gobindo, carrying the captured, knocked out Octopussy to the plane for the finale of the film. And it's this where Barry picks up the pace a little bit, but adds that little tinge of a feeling of mystery as Bond is looking at the blank wall at the end of the corridor, trying to find if there's a hidden door. But then especially the pace starts to pick up as our villains make off with horses at the break of dawn, and then Bond commandeers a horse and has to make the incredible horse-to-plane transfer. And right there at that moment, as dawn is breaking, and then Barry comes in with what I think is the pièce de résistance of the entire score, of coming in with the sound of a gong on the James Bond theme as the music starts to fade out as we go into the actual aerial sequence. It's really, for me, it's the summation of the entire score, and that is the moment above all where we have James Bond in boy's own adventure territory. And John Barry knows it as much as the audience does, and that's where we get the real crescendo of I think the entire score. So that for me in particular, that end of the Monsoon Palace assault sequence is my favorite part of the entirety of the Octopussy score, and that is where John Barry is really reaching into the classical adventure playbook more than anything, and very befitting of someone who is, as all people should be, who is a great fan of the classic Gunga Din. So now we turn to the beautiful La La Land Records 40th anniversary reissue of the score on this lovely 2-disc set on 2 CDs. So this is giving us finally an expanded score that is a legitimate expanded score. It doesn't simply have dialogue tracks from the film tucked in as the original Rykodisc release did. And we finally get away from the 1983 soundtrack LP program, which was very good for the time, but basically made around the limitations and the runtime limitations of having a single LP. And it's been stuck that way until now. There was a very rare early 80s CD release that became a collector's item and is incredibly rare and even more expensive. And then finally, it was given a CD reissue on the Rykodisc release, which was then ported to the 2003 remaster as part of the 2003 Capitol Remasters project. And this, once again, was the exact same 1983 program, but now easily available on CD. But that's all we've had. So getting anything additional is unbelievable, but getting a fully expanded score plus a second disc containing a new version of the original 1983 soundtrack program is unfathomable. So the mere announcement of this was just head explode for all of us Bond fans who just had given up hope on these scores getting any more love or attention since the 2003 remasters. And the hope is that La La Land Records can continue, and they want to. It's just a matter of getting Eon and MGM to actually give the okay. Now, the issue for the La La Land team, headed by Neil S. Bulk, who produced this release, who very kindly has emailed with me some and answered some of my very nerdy questions, they had difficulty in actually locating a source to use for this new anniversary CD expansion. And it took quite a bit of doing, but apparently they were finally able to locate a master source, which turned out to be a tape that was quarter-inch, a two-track stereo master that was transferred at 24:176 in terms of it being a higher bit rate transfer. But it is quite unsettling that when the soundtrack label goes to locate the original Octopussy score master tape, that people just don't know where it is. And I think this is similar to how for some time it was thought that the master tape for the Moonraker score was lost, and that led to still to this day there are fan forum discussions and fans wondering, do we have to I think there was an attempt to do a Kickstarter to try and re-record the Moonraker score, and overall fan worry about the preservation status of the James Bond scores, which kind of goes hand in hand with how Eon and Capitol and MGM and everyone involved doesn't seem to want to pay much attention to the original films, and especially in the soundtrack realm. But unfortunately, the state of the actual film mixes themselves is quite dire. So there needs to be it seems a real overhaul and a dedicated effort to actually get the library straight in terms of knowing exactly where everything is. So the next time La La Land Records comes to do one of the film scores, which hopefully they are allowed to do so soon, because these are the greatest James Bond physical media releases in decades. Hopefully the next time around, it's not the same sort of, we don't know where they are, which leads to worry and, of course, panic. But then also, okay, it's got to be somewhere, but we got to figure out where it is and which vault will it be in, and having to figure out with all the entities involved where these materials might be and what is the best material that survives. So here on disc 1 we have the presentation of the newly expanded score plus additional music cues, and what this does is essentially give us all of the material we've always loved in the film that just never had on a soundtrack release. So, of course, that means the incredible first cue when we see India for the first time is here. But also a lot of little small pieces are here. And in particular, I know every James Bond fan will do a double-taking pigeon double take when suddenly you hear the source music for the Snake Charmer scene, and we actually have on this release the Snake Charmer version of the James Bond theme played by VJ when Bond first arrives as part of the recognition signal. And every James Bond fan worth their salt, when that happens, will get immediately happy and say to their stereo speakers, "That's a charming tune. You do take English money." "Only gold sovereigns." So now the actual score program runs just over an hour, including All Time High twice, because of course it was the title song and then used again as the end title. But then we also have additional music cues, which are placed after the main program. And this was done, I think, to sort of not interrupt the actual flow of the actual album program, as most of these are more source music, but also listening to this overall first disc gives us brand new musical cues we've not heard before. In particular, there is distinct and completely different music used for the end of the Mishka and Grishka characters. So this has ostensibly what John Barry originally composed and recorded for those scenes, but that was changed entirely, and so we got in the film during those moments more of a switch to the actual music used during the killing of 009 at the opening, which makes more sense, I think, and fits very well and mirrors that. And that is especially perfect for the scene ending and culminating in Bond turning the tables with the throwing knives, because that mirrors the killing of 009 perfectly, even the setting. So it's very fitting that the final music actually does that in the film. But it's fascinating suddenly getting to these tracks where, again, any Bond fan who knows the film like the back of their hand will suddenly sit up, bolt upright, and go, "What is this?" So you do get some of those in here, which is fantastic. So this does contain brand new to us music that has not been released before. Must have been on this Stereo Master tape. But it doesn't include, again, the music that's used as the source music in the casino during the backgammon scene, which seems to have originally just been slated for the beautiful instrumental of All Time High that we hear a bit of later on when Bond and Magda are having their dinner. I've heard the price of eggs was going up, but don't you think that's a little high? Then the other, as I alluded to, is during the manhunt sequence, where we have some of the source music for the start and part of that sequence, but not all the little pieces. And in particular, we don't have the little musical sting when Bond walks through the sort of tarantula spider's nest. But those are the only two things I can think of that are not really here represented, and those seem like much later changes. So again, it probably was not on the stereo master tape that they were able to access for this release. But it is absolutely amazing to be able to hear the Octopussy score not be locked to the original 1983 program, to have some of the tracks run longer, or have what we actually are used to from the film, because this has been one of the Bond films that you really have to basically take the film audio and either try to extract the score or just listen to that in addition to the original soundtrack to actually have the whole score experience. Then on disc 2, we essentially have a recreation of the 1983 soundtrack program, track for track, and some of these do have slightly different run times as opposed to what's on disc 1, so it's important to preserve that. But this being a La La Land release, they went the extra mile because disc 2 has a bonus track of its own, which you'll see here listed as the extended instrumental version of All Time High. And that is actually from the original 7-inch 45 single. The B-side of the Rita Coolidge performed title song is actually this very lovely, unique, extended instrumental version of All Time High. And it has been locked to the original 7-inch. This is my copy of the US single. It's definitely worn, and the 45 is definitely a bit noisy, but I really love the additional instrumental version, and it's more unique John Barry material, so I'm just meant to get a better copy of this, but now I don't have to. So it was amazing to see that they went the extra mile and actually located and included a lovely new high-res transfer of the instrumental version found on the B-side of the title song single. Now, in terms of the overall packaging and artwork, we have another replication of the beautiful, iconic original teaser artwork that was used for the original soundtrack, so that carries over. To distinguish it from the 2003 CD, we have this sort of shiny gold edge border that was also on the Live and Let Die CD. But we also have a nice limited edition with the 007 logos here inside of the jewel case. Of course, the rear lists the full contents of the 2 discs and the new extra bonus tracks. Inside, we have great imagery from the film, nicely printed, and the disc labels themselves are a very straightforward but very eloquent rendition of the original Octopussy title, and I like that the color used for the actual label goes very well with the red of the title, and also this design matches the other La La Land James Bond releases. Of course, we have a hinge tray with disc 2 with lovely matching disc artwork, and a lovely shot of Roger there, which, of course, whenever you watch the film, if you're a Bond nerd, you note that Bond is not using the PPK in the film. Then for the actual booklet, again, this is done to the usual very high quality La La Land standard. Lovely printing, a nice finish on the pages to make everything have a nice gloss finish on the images, and a lovely, very readable text. The actual booklet essay is by John Burlingame. This is basically a tweaked and slightly reworked version of his chapter on the Octopussy score in his must-read book, The Music of James Bond, which is essential for any Bond fan's bookshelf. So this is a plug for John Burlingame's book. If you haven't read this, please go buy a copy now, because there is no better definitive statement on the history and composition of the James Bond scores. So this is basically the chapter reworked into CD booklet form, but with really lovingly printed images, specially selected. So while it's not really going to give you anything new if you already have Burlingame's book, it's really nice for those who haven't read his book or don't have a copy. And also, it's the best write-up anyone has done on the Octopussy score, so it makes sense why it was here. Again, as with Live and Let Die, my only real criticism about the entirety of the release is that I wish the booklet had a little bit of text about the actual source transfer, and really a little bit of the story of how it was a little difficult to actually get a source to use for this release. I do really like it when releases have something about the transfer, essentially, whether it's a page or a paragraph or something. But at least this information is readily available online in terms of forum posts, and also there's a really wonderful podcast interview that Neil S. Bulk did that I'll link to in the description. So I've basically covered most of the transfer notes, but also this information is out there, so at least you can find out about it. But I just wish there was some sort of mention in here somewhere about the source used and what resolution it was transferred at, just so somebody picking this up would have some idea of what the actual material was that was involved. And then we also have the credits for the new release, and produced by Neil S. Bulk and mastered by Doug Schwartz, who, like his mastering on the Live and Let Die release, does an excellent job. So to talk about the sound quality of this release, which is, it is just such a night and day experience compared to what we've had before, that I don't even think it's fair to compare this to past releases. This is me, so I do this anyway. This new release is by far and away the most beautifully detailed and fresh listening experience you will ever have with the Octopussy score compared to what's come before. The expansion of the score and all the new cues and all of the new material we've not heard before that was not used in the film, and having the bonus tracks of source music and other things, it's a treasure trove. It is literally Operation Trove. You'll be replacing the 1983 soundtrack program. It turned up dead because it couldn't compare to the La La Land release. I couldn't resist. But anyway, it is just a remarkable achievement by La La Land Records, who once again hits it out of the park. This is one of the great treasures for James Bond fans in terms of, we have been starving, we have been dying of thirst in the desert of not having truly great physical media releases, and especially in the soundtrack realm. It is astounding that we got an expansion of a John Barry Bond score. I didn't think that was ever going to be possible due to all of the legalities and different entities involved. I thought we would be lucky if we got expanded versions of all the Pierce Brosnan era scores. So now that we're able to see some of the truly classic era of films get this type of love and attention that they have never gotten before on, frankly, any of their physical media releases is astounding. This is greater love, care, and affection given to the score than the actual film has gotten on any of its physical media releases. So this is another example, like Live and Let Die, of a beautifully produced soundtrack that is done, I think, about as best as it possibly could be. That is a better release than the actual current release and iteration of the film itself. So La La Land Records has really knocked it out of the park. Neil S. Bulk and the whole team involved with this release, like the Live and Let Die release, really just, you get the level of care that went into this as you're listening and experiencing this. And as someone who grew up with the film and always wished there was a full soundtrack release and was really tired of it being limited to just the 1983 soundtrack program. I mean, I just listened to this over and over again when I got it, not believing that I finally had in my hands and was listening to an expanded soundtrack that was fully restored and sounded incredible. And there are moments where you will pick out details that have not been very clear before. The previous masters were all good, but they were based on the original 1983 LP master, which is a great piece of vinyl for its time and also one of the better sounding of the original James Bond soundtracks when you're looking at the original vinyl releases, which was released on the A&M label because Bond sort of hopped around different labels. But you could tell it was done at the time of the film, and one always felt that it could sound better. Well, it finally does. It is a beautiful new transfer and mastering job, and it's just amazing to be able to hear some of these tracks for the first time on an actual release outside of the film, plus the new unique material, but also the tracks we're used to from the original soundtrack program, hearing them in even greater detail and not sticking to the actual soundtrack edits. I mean, it's a treasure. It is a treasure for James Bond fans. This is something that we shouldn't have had to wait this long to get, but it was worth the wait. Don't get me wrong. It is very much worth every single penny of the purchasing price and more. It is really the release the score has always deserved. And it will, I think, give people a greater appreciation of Barry's Octopussy score. Even the title song has nuances that were not as apparent on the past releases. So even if you just listen to All Time High across the different releases and you then listen to All Time High on the new La La Land release for the first time, you're going to notice an increase in clarity right off the bat. In fact, I think this is the best sounding version I've heard of it outside of the film mix on the Laserdisc. I mean, it sounds fantastic. But again, all the past releases have sounded great, but they were limited because they were based on the original soundtrack program from 1983. So again, this is a treasure trove for Bond fans. It, along with Live and Let Die and the other La La Land releases, are the greatest James Bond physical media releases since the 2003 Capitol remastered project. That's how long we've had to wait for something, really anything in the James Bond world in terms of physical media. And this is, I'm talking about the film releases in this. When I say physical media, I mean everything overall. These La La Land releases are the first physical media releases of any James Bond material to have everybody trying their absolute best to get everything right and respect these materials as the art they always have been. So that really makes them ultra special to us Bond fans who, again, have been dying of starvation in the desert of not having proper James Bond physical media releases or soundtrack releases or proper restorations all this time. So one can only hope that La La Land is able to continue, and hopefully we don't have to wait years and years and years for every film to hit an anniversary for somebody at MGM to say, oh yeah, you guys should do that. but it seems like that's what we're going to have to wait for. So hopefully we see some more releases relatively soon, as both Live and Let Die and Octopussy have sold very well. But these are, you do have to keep in mind, they are limited to a certain print run, and they will sell out sooner rather than later. And this being a John Barry Bond score, it's going to sell out. So if you are interested in picking this up, and if you've made it to this point in this video, or you even call yourself a James Bond fan, of course you're interested, please go to La La Land's website or your favorite boutique soundtrack retailer and pick up a copy sooner rather than later, because once it's gone, you're going to be facepalming yourself as you're trying to win bidding wars on eBay for in a very exorbitant price amount. So those are my thoughts on the La La Land 40th anniversary release of John Barry's Octopussy score in this beautiful 2 CD expanded and not only remastered but restored release that finally gives us a release that is worthy of this incredible score and really allows the listener to fully appreciate what John Barry achieved here and what he would go on further to do in his final 2 Bond scores. So his work on Octopussy does very much lead into both the A View to a Kill and the Living Daylight scores, both of which I hope get the same treatment by La La Land sooner rather than later, because those masterpieces need this level of care, as do all of the James Bond scores. So as always, I hope my babbles about the world of James Bond soundtrack releases and soundtrack collecting has been at least somewhat fun and informative. Again, my thanks to the wonderful Neil S. Bulk, who not only produced this release, but was kind enough to answer my super nerdy, geeky emails. And so we've had a bit of a conversation going. And he was able to give me a couple of technical tidbits about the transfer and stuff. So that's how I found out about the transfer resolution, because I'm that guy who wonders what the digital sampling rate was for the transfer of the source tape material. But you don't have to talk with the producer of this release to know that this has just the utmost care put into it. Everybody really tried. You can tell, as with all boutique soundtrack releases, I think, that every single one of them is a labor of love. Yes, they are a bit on the pricier side, because these are all smaller boutique soundtrack labels having to pay exorbitant licensing costs and then having to deal with aspects of the motion picture industry that are not front and center in everybody's minds in 2024. But they are doing such incredible work, not only in releases, but also, really, most of all, the preservation of soundtracks, because each new transfer and restoration process is indeed a full restoration of the best elements they can find, and trying to bring and restore that soundtrack to its greatest possible luster, and usually restoring the composer's original intent. So by purchasing each and every boutique soundtrack release, you are supporting further efforts. You are encouraging and allowing and providing for the means to be able to continue this work, and it doesn't get bandied about in the way that it should. Every one of the boutique soundtrack labels is doing incredible work, and in most cases, quite frankly, as we see here on Octopussy, they're doing better work than the studios are with the actual films. They not only care about the films and the scores, but they care and stress and strive to get everything right to the best of their ability. And that is the level of commitment that we need to see from everyone else in the film industry in terms of handling catalog titles and performing film restorations. It's sad on one hand that these efforts are pretty much locked to being only talked about within the soundtrack collectors community, but also that lets you know that the people working on these are fans just like you, and they're just as dedicated, and all of that effort and care goes into each and every release. And this is just this is a treasure. This is a treasure that I have wanted to see my entire life, and now we finally have a beautifully restored, expanded version of John Barry's Octopussy score to put on the James Bond shelf as something to just look at and admire and know that at least one element of the James Bond universe has been given the full deluxe treatment that it's always deserved, even if the rest of the James Bond universe hasn't quite gotten there yet. So as always, please do keep supporting independent soundtrack labels and, of course, your local music stores by buying soundtracks on beautiful releases like this in order to ensure the preservation of soundtracks, because each soundtrack you purchase from a boutique label means they can restore and move on to other soundtracks, but also it helps to keep the real culture and history of film scores alive. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching. Well, I have exactly 1 hour, 53 minutes, and 11 seconds to listen to the entirety of the Octopussy 2 CD 40th anniversary score release before catching that flight, sir.